Okay, so I'm here with Emma O'Neill. Emma, do you want to just give a quick introduction to yourself and the research that you do?
Yeah, sure. So my name's Emma. I'm a PhD student at UCD. I'm working in computational linguistics. So specifically, my thesis is on different accent variation in English and how we model that, and then how that affects perceptions on phonology and written media.
Brilliant, thank you. And just before we get started, thank you for agreeing to take part in my research. It's very much appreciated. Okay, so let's just jump into it then. So why does speech recognition software struggle so much to sort of understand certain accents? And I'm thinking there specifically like regional accents, things or Scottish accents, Irish accents, or, you know, even more kind of niche, you know, Wigan accents even. Why does technology struggle to understand those?
So it's essentially the case of, you know, technology will work best on the sort of data that it's been most exposed to. So if you're training a system to do voice recognition, the sort of audio that you give it is what it's going to perform best on. And right now there are some accents where we have more data available than others. And that could be because there aren't a lot of speakers of that variant, or it could just be that they're not groups that tend to participate in data collection, or they're just not actively targeted for this. And that can be done, that can be a result of things like the perceived prestige of a particular variant. So things like RP English tend to be the default assumption of British English. So if you want a system that does British English, you'll tend to lean more towards collecting RP English data. And that means that you perform worse on other varieties of British English. So any sort of Northern variants, Scottish variants, Welsh variants, everything else kind of falls by the wayside.
Gotcha. So essentially what you're saying is if in the research process, if the researchers maybe have a bias towards a certain accent, and then that gets incorporated into the way that they train these programs, the end result of the technology could be a biased result. And so I'm like, I have in mind an example, which is my dad with his Wigan accent trying to communicate with an Alexa, which is a hysterical situation. And you know, when those technologies are being made, what you're saying is then the companies that make them just don't incorporate enough regional accents into the data.
Yeah, and it's probably not for lack of trying. So those sorts of systems take huge amounts of data. And essentially they're getting that from anywhere they can. And because we already have a lot of data for particular varieties, that's what's being used, just because there's more of it. So it's more heavily weighted in it. So there will be examples of, you know, your weird Wigan accent in that. There's just not enough that it's well represented in the data. It's more about representation than just it not being included. Gotcha.
Okay. Oh, thank you. Okay, so the next question that I have for you is about the technology currently where it stands. At the moment, can computers identify the accent of the speaker?
So there's a lot of ongoing work in terms of sort of accent identification, different like distinguishing between different variants and things like identifying, you know, what maybe a non-native speaker's native language, because that can help with, like, you know, language teaching. It's still an open area, so there's essentially, in terms of machine learning, it comes down to like a classification task. So you basically give it as many examples as you can of the different classes and hope that it can generalize and pick out distinguishing features. So for instance, if you give it, you know, here's a bunch of Scottish accents and here's a bunch of English accents, one of the things that it might pick out is that, okay, English accents tend to not have the R sounds in particular words. So things like bird and worm, whereas I would say like bird and worm. So that's like a really distinguishing feature between those two.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you're dealing with a person, and a person's accent is influenced by every experience they've had, everywhere they've ever lived. Like, it's constantly changing and adapting. So there's really no such thing as a specific accent for a specific place. There's features that tend to be common to a particular area. There's features that tend to be common to a particular age group, a particular gender, a particular sexual orientation, a particular race, things like that. But it's a combination of all of these things that makes up a person and that makes up how they communicate.
Gotcha. That was a really good answer. Okay. And sort of like kind of going off that then, how can unconscious or conscious bias in the research that is being done impact the end results of the technologies that we use?
So again, the main thing is whatever is going into the system is what the system is going to learn. So if the data that's going in has these biases, if it's biased towards a particular variant, if it's excluding particular demographics, then you're going to end up with a system that has those biases. And it's a big issue in the entire like machine learning and artificial intelligence field right now, is because most of the systems that people are developing today take huge amounts of data. And so they can't all there's no way to check all of the data to like make sure it doesn't contain kind of awful biased things in it.
Right.
So anything that's going into your system is going to be captured by your system. And that includes any sort of societal discrimination and biases and things like that. If you've got that existing in the world, and if that's existing in just the representation of people and in your data collection, then that's what's being captured in your system.
I read there was an article maybe from a year ago that was talking about the difficulties that African American men have when communicating with Alexa and Siri, and I would presume that it's like because of exactly what you've just said there. So yeah, that's really okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, if you bear in mind as well that like if you're a company that's commissioning data collection, when you're getting participants to like participate in a study, or like, oh, can you come in and record your voice? The people that you're getting in are people who are privileged enough to take time out of work to come and do something like that. Or you're getting people who are university educated because they're students and they're doing it as part of a course. Like it's a particular group of people who are even able to participate in something like that. So unless you have someone specifically going out to a particular demographic, a particular group of people, a particular language community to get their representation included, then you're not going to target the right people.
Yeah, so there would be an inherent kind of underrepresentation of maybe working class speakers, and it would skew towards the more educated, probably predominantly more white communities. Okay, and so how about speakers who have speech impairments? Is like currently in this computational linguistics world, I know it's not your area specifically, but is there ways that the technology can account for those kind of differences to more common speech? Is there a way that the research is accounting for that?
Yeah, so there are specific groups that will target like specific speech impairments and particular deteriorating diseases and things like that. Because the idea is that when you have speech that is, I don't want to say non-standard because I hate the term, but that's deviating from what is traditionally modeled. Yeah. What you need is a specialized way of dealing with that. You need a model that's specifically trained on that way of speaking. And that's also where you kind of get a lot of the sort of linguistic theory crossover. Because it's not just a case of, especially when you're working with like particular impairments, it's usually the case that you don't have a lot of data on that. It's obviously a much more restricted pool of people that you can collect data from. So the idea nowadays is a lot of, can we take your traditional system and then use what we know about how this impairment has affected this person's way of speaking, and include that information into it so that the model can adapt. So it has a generic model, say, of English, and then it learns specifically how English and how the sounds in English would change for this type of impairment. So it's more about tuning a particular model to someone else, because we don't have enough data to learn a system just on that.
Wow. Right. Okay. Thank you. And like, I suppose then, thinking about other ways that this kind of technology is now used in industry, like are there other examples of like innovative uses of speech tech currently?
Yeah, so I mean, I think everyone's familiar with your things like your Siri and your Alexa and your kind of personal assistants and things like that. But so right now I'm working as an intern with a company in Dublin, Soapbox Labs, and they do specifically voice recognition targeted for children's speech. So obviously the way children speak, you know, they're still growing, they're still developing their language skills, and you know, there's the shapes of their mouth is different. So the way they speak deviates again from what a traditional model would capture. And again, they need specific tools that are targeted towards their speech and data that's collected from children. So what they do is they do voice recognition, and it allows for integration into like educational apps. So you can have a kid who's, you know, reading a story along at home, reading aloud, and you can have a system that monitors that can, you know, help them when they're struggling. It can alert a teacher to, like, you know, these are the words that they've struggled with. And essentially what you can have is a kid who can sit and learn independently, either in the classroom or at home, without needing to have a teacher sat with them all times. Which has obviously been really great during the pandemic when all the kids are sitting at home.
Definitely. That's really cool. And I'm wondering as well if, like, you know, eventually we might see that kind of data being used by, you know, the Siris and the Alexas, because I anecdotally, like, I've seen kids try to communicate with those kinds of devices, and it's just like they just can't get it, you know.
Yeah, and it's weird because the kids right now are growing up in a world where they should, in theory, be able to interact with pretty much everything using their voices.
Yeah.
But the technology isn't quite at the level that it's understanding them. And that's putting that on the kid. That's saying it's your fault that you can't be understood, because this is something that everyone else can do. And that shouldn't be the case. We should be saying we need the technology to catch up with these kids, because they expect to be able to ask Alexa to play their favorite song or play whatever TV show they're looking for and things like that.
And like, just out of interest, while I have you here, so for instance, if I'm talking to Alexa and she isn't understanding something that I'm saying, what I often find myself doing is I will change the way that I speak. I will typically end up speaking kind of like it's like the telephone voice, you know, kind of like posh English version of what I'm saying. And annoyingly, that often works. But am I doing something wrong when I do that? Am I training Alexa in the wrong way, or is the tech not that advanced?
I mean, your data won't be being collected in that moment to train the system. That's done kind of outside. But before it gets put in a box and sent to your house, it's already trained and ready to go. And the thing is, the data that it was trained on probably has more of that telephone voice. And that's the thing, when people use a voice recognition, like any piece of voice recognition technology, and they're not being understood, you immediately see people have this idea of, okay, this is my accent and I have to be a better accent. And it's really interesting to hear what people think is then the correct way of speaking, because there's no such thing as a correct way of speaking. If you're fluent in English, however you speak English is a perfectly valid way of speaking English. There's no better version or, you know, more correct version or anything like that. There isn't a standard English, but there's an inherent bias in the system in terms of what varieties of English it has already been exposed to. So when you change your accent, it's not that you're, you know, being more articulate or speaking correctly. It's just that you're now sounding a bit more like something that the machine's heard before. Right.
I suddenly feel vindicated for having an accent that isn't posh or, you know, very obviously English. Well, maybe a bit. Okay. I think you answered all of my questions there, Emma. So we might call that a day here then. Thank you very much again for agreeing to take part in this research.
No bother.